Listen closely, because this is one of those topics that will split a room in half before the first sentence is finished. Were Africans in the Americas before slavery, before Columbus, before 1619? Some people hear that question and say, absolutely. Some people hear it and say, not possible. And most people hear it and realize something even more unsettling. They were never taught enough to even know what they believe. That's the problem. Not that everyone has different opinions. The problem is that we were handed a version of history that was thin, sanitized, and incomplete. And then we were told to treat that version like it was the full story. So today, we're doing something different. We're not doing a viral argument. We're not doing a hot take. We're doing an investigation. We're going to lay out both sides of the argument, what people claim, what people point to as evidence, what serious critics push back on, and what mainstream institutions say is acceptable proof. And then we're going to talk about the bigger truth underneath the whole debate, why this conversation exists in the first place, why people are hungry for an older timeline, why the schooling we got left so many of us feeling like our story started in captivity. Because even if you don't agree with every claim on the Africans were here first side, even if you land on the skeptical side by the end of this, one thing is still undeniable. African and Black history has never been properly accounted for in public schooling, not in depth, not with dignity, not with the fullness of context we deserve. Most of us learned a history where Black people appear like a sudden event, a problem to be managed, a labor force, a chapter, a unit, but not a civilization, not architects of knowledge, not builders of global culture, not explorers, thinkers, strategists, and survivors with a long timeline. And that does something to a people. When your timeline is shortened, your imagination gets shortened. When your history is minimized, your future starts feeling negotiable. That's why this question hits so hard, because it isn't just a question about boats and dates. It's a question about identity. It's a question about belonging. It's a question about whether we were always global or whether we only arrived as property. And if you're feeling emotional right now, that's not weakness. That's your spirit reacting to a gap, a missing piece, a silence you've lived with your whole life and maybe didn't even have language for. So here's the thesis for this investigation. We are not here to tell you what to believe. We are here to expose how little we were taught and to take this debate seriously enough to examine it with real care. Because truth doesn't need hype. Truth needs structure. Truth needs receipts. Truth needs humility. And truth needs people who are brave enough to admit when the official story might be incomplete. So in the next section, we're going to lay out what the yes side argues, what they point to, why it's compelling to so many people, and what questions that evidence raises. Then we will do the skeptical side the right way, not dismissal, not ridicule, but real critique, real standards, real academic pushback. Because if we're going to reclaim history, we're going to do it with integrity, not desperation, not fantasy. Let's investigate. So let's begin with the side of the argument that says, yes, Africans may have been in the Americas long before slavery. This position doesn't come from one person, one book, or one claim. It comes from a constellation of ideas, interpretations, and historical challenges that have been raised over decades. Supporters of this view often start with a basic premise that African civilizations were not isolated, primitive, or landlocked. They were maritime. They were mathematically sophisticated. They navigated rivers, coastlines, and open seas long before Europe dominated global exploration narratives. Long before Columbus ever sailed, African societies were trading across vast distances. They were building ships, mapping stars, studying currents, understanding seasonal winds. So the first argument goes like this: if Africans had the knowledge and the technology to travel, then the idea that they could have crossed the Atlantic is not inherently impossible. From there, proponents point to what they describe as clues, not proof, clues. They reference contested interpretations of ancient artifacts found in parts of the Americas. They point to sculptures, carvings, and iconography that some believe show African features. They discuss similarities in language, culture, or agricultural practices that they argue are not easily explained by coincidence alone. Others bring in oral histories, stories passed down through generations in African and indigenous communities that speak of contact, exchange, or presence long before European arrival. And this matters because oral history, for much of the world, was history. Written records were not the only way civilizations preserved truth. But oral traditions were often dismissed by Western institutions as unreliable or unscientific. Some researchers also point to early European accounts, mentions of dark-skinned people encountered in the Americas before large-scale African enslavement began. Accounts that exist, but are rarely highlighted in mainstream education. To people who support this position, these pieces feel like fragments of a larger story, not clean, not perfectly preserved, but familiar. And here's the emotional undercurrent you need to understand. For many Black people, this argument doesn't begin in academia, it begins in a wound. It begins with the feeling that our story starts in chains, that our presence in the world is always framed as arrival through suffering, that we appear in history as labor, not as people with agency, mobility, or choice. So when someone says, "What if we were already here?" it doesn't just feel like a historical claim, it feels like a reclamation of dignity, of autonomy, of a longer timeline that doesn't begin with trauma. That's why this argument resonates so deeply, not because everyone has reviewed the evidence in detail, but because it pushes back against a narrative that has always felt incomplete. Supporters will tell you this. They will say that history has never been neutral, that power decides which records are preserved, funded, and taught, that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially when entire peoples were excluded from record-keeping institutions. They will argue that European exploration was not the beginning of global contact, it was simply the beginning of who got credit for it. And to be clear, many people who lean toward this side are not saying every claim is airtight. They are saying the question itself was never given a fair investigation, that ridicule replaced research, that curiosity was shut down before it could mature into serious inquiry. But this is where responsible investigation demands we pause, because compelling doesn't automatically mean correct, and emotional resonance doesn't replace standards of proof. So before we draw conclusions, we have to ask the harder questions. What counts as evidence? Who sets that standard? And where do claims fall apart under scrutiny? That's why in the next stage, we're going to do something just as important. We're going to walk through the skeptical side, the academic pushback, the critiques that historians and archaeologists raise, not to dismiss this conversation, but to pressure test it. Because if this history is going to be reclaimed, it has to survive honest examination. Let's go there next. Now we have to slow down, because serious investigation requires something many conversations avoid: pushback. This is where historians, archaeologists, and academics step in and say, hold on, compelling stories are not the same as proven history. The skeptical position doesn't begin with hostility, it begins with standards. Mainstream scholars argue that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and when it comes to the idea of Africans in the Americas before Columbus, they say the evidence does not yet meet that bar. Let's break down what that means. First, archaeology. Physical evidence is expected to be verifiable, datable, and clearly attributable. artifacts must be found in documented contexts, not removed from their original sites. They must be tested, retested, and independently confirmed.
Many of the objects cited by proponents of pre-Columbian African presence, critics argue, fail these tests. Some were discovered outside of controlled excavations. Some lack reliable dating. Others can be explained through known indigenous cultures or later contact periods. Then there's the issue of interpretation. Skeptics warn that seeing African features in ancient sculptures is not the same as proving African origin. Human facial features overlap across populations. Projecting modern racial categories onto ancient art can distort what those artists intended to represent. Linguistic similarities are also questioned. Languages across the world share sounds and structures. Without strong historical linkage, resemblance alone is not proof of contact. And oral history, while culturally significant, is treated cautiously by academic institutions, not because it lacks value, but because memory can shift over time, blend stories, or be reshaped by later events. Historians argue that oral traditions must be corroborated by material evidence to be considered historical proof. Another major concern raised by skeptics is confirmation bias, the human tendency to search for evidence that supports what we want to be true, while overlooking evidence that complicates the narrative. Critics argue that some writers and researchers begin with the conclusion, then assemble fragments that appear to support it, rather than letting the evidence lead wherever it may. They also point out that if sustained African contact with the Americas existed before Columbus, we would expect to see clearer traces, African plants, animals, technologies, or genetic markers showing widespread integration across the continent. So far, they argue, such patterns have not been convincingly demonstrated. From this perspective, the story of global contact before European expansion is not denied, but it is treated with caution, careful, slow, methodical caution. And here's the part that often gets lost. Many scholars pushing back on these claims are not trying to erase Black history, they are trying to protect historical method. Because once standards are loosened for one group, they can be loosened to distort any history. This is where the tension lives. On one side, people say, our history was erased, dismissed, and underfunded. On the other side, institutions say, we cannot replace one incomplete story with another unproven one. And both sides, in their best form, are actually arguing for truth. The problem is that most people were never taught how to sit inside that tension. They were taught answers, not inquiry. So the debate turns into shouting instead of study, belief instead of investigation, rejection instead of refinement. But if we're being honest, the skeptical critique doesn't end the conversation, it complicates it. Because even if every controversial claim were set aside, even if you accepted the academic position entirely, you would still be left with a massive question. Why was Black history presented to us as so narrow, so late, and so incomplete in the first place? That's where this investigation has to go next, because the debate itself is a symptom, not the root. And in the next stage, we're going to talk about that root. Public schooling, historical erasure, and why so many people are searching for answers outside of official narratives. That's where the real story begins. So now we have to ask a different question, not whether every claim about pre-Columbian African presence holds up, but why so many people feel the need to search for an older timeline in the first place. Because this debate did not appear out of nowhere, it grew in a vacuum created by public schooling, selective history, and institutional omission. Let's be honest about what most of us were taught. In school, African history often begins abruptly, with slavery, with capture, with forced labor, with survival. There is very little context about Africa before that moment, little discussion of civilizations, of trade networks, of philosophy, of governance, of science. Africa appears in the curriculum not as a source of culture, but as a supplier of bodies. And that framing matters. Because when a people's history begins with subjugation, it quietly teaches them that power always belonged to someone else, that agency was never theirs, that movement, exploration, and global presence were foreign concepts. So when people later encounter claims that challenge that framing, it doesn't feel like misinformation, it feels like correction. Even if the claims are imperfect, even if they are debated, they are responding to something real. The truth is, American public schooling was never designed to tell a complete story. It was designed to tell a functional one, a story that centered Europe, a story that made colonial expansion seem inevitable, orderly, and justified. And within that story, Black people appear late and briefly and usually in pain. So when institutions say there's not enough evidence to support these claims, many people hear something else entirely. They hear, "We don't think your questions are worth funding. We don't think your history is worth digging for. We don't think your absence in the record is a problem." And that's where trust breaks. Because even when skepticism is methodologically sound, it's operating inside a system that has already failed to account for us. This is the paradox. Academic caution is important, but so is acknowledging that entire histories were under-researched, under-documented, and under-taught. So people go looking elsewhere. They search books that weren't assigned. They follow oral traditions their grandparents told them. They listen to voices outside the institution. Not because they hate scholarship, but because scholarship didn't show up for them first. And here's the quiet truth. Most of us were never taught how to think historically. We were taught what to memorize, what to repeat, what would be on the test. We weren't taught how narratives are built, how power shapes archives, how absence can be intentional, or how to hold uncertainty without fear. So when controversial ideas surface, people feel forced to choose sides instead of asking better questions. Believe everything, or reject everything. But real historical inquiry lives in the middle. It asks, what do we know? What do we not know? And why don't we know it? And that's where this conversation belongs. Not in blind belief, not in instant dismissal, but in a serious reckoning with the fact that Black history was never fully integrated into the American story. And when a story leaves people out long enough, they will rewrite it themselves. The question is not whether that impulse is wrong. The question is how we guide it responsibly. Because reclaiming history doesn't mean abandoning rigor. It means expanding the scope of what we are willing to study. And that brings us to the final stage: what we believe, how we move forward, and how people can begin rebuilding historical literacy with grounded, credible resources. That's where we land this. So where do we land? We land here. We do not believe history should be reduced to belief systems, and we do not believe curiosity should be punished just because it makes institutions uncomfortable. At House of Asseveration, our position is simple. We are pro-inquiry, we are pro-evidence, and we are pro-context. We don't need to prove that Africans were everywhere to know that Black history was undertaught, underfunded, and under-respected. We don't need certainty about every ancient voyage to acknowledge that our timeline was shortened on purpose. And we reject the idea that the only responsible position is silence, because silence is what created this gap in the first place. Spiritually speaking, disconnection from ancestry creates disorientation. When people don't know where they come from, they struggle to know where they're going. And when history only shows you yourself as conquered, it quietly teaches you to expect less of your future. Reclaiming history is not about fantasy, it's about grounding, it's about dignity, it's about restoring continuity where rupture was enforced. But reclamation without discipline becomes mythology, and discipline without curiosity becomes erasure. So the way forward is balance. Learn deeply, question responsibly, read widely, and stop outsourcing your understanding of history to systems that never prioritized your fullness to begin with. That's why we don't just talk about these issues, we offer tools. If you want a serious place to start, we recommend Before the Mayflower by Lerone Bennett Jr., not because it answers every question, but because it expands the timeline most of us were never given. It places Black history in America within a broader, richer context. It reminds us that we did not enter history as footnotes, and it gives you something solid to stand on while you continue asking bigger questions. We've made this book available through the link in our profile. You'll find it in our link tree. This is not a belief you're purchasing, it's access, it's context, it's a starting point. If you're tired of shallow narratives, if you're tired of being told what you're allowed to question, if you're ready to build your own understanding instead of inheriting someone else's version of history, click the link, read for yourself, and stay with us. Because this investigation doesn't end here. This is the first chapter of many, and history deserves to be handled with more care than we were ever taught to give it.